All right, what's up guys? Today we're gonna be doing a 100-hour service on this 115 Mercury Pro XS attached to this beautiful Mako 18 LTS. And to get started, I'm gonna go over what you need to do the 100-hour service on this motor. So starting out, obviously, we're gonna be doing an oil change. Now the 115, it takes 7 quarts of 10W30, and of course, you're gonna need your oil filter as well. And then with the 100-hour service, we're also gonna be changing out the gear lube. It only takes a quart, just a little bit under a quart. And then next is the spark plugs. We're also gonna be changing the thermostat. It already comes preloaded in the housing. Of course, your water pump impeller. And then over here we have a fuel filter. We have the zincs that go on the lower unit. And then this is your zinc that goes underneath the power trim. And that's everything to do the 100-hour service. And of course, there's a few other things you'll need, such as marine grease. I like to put dielectric grease on the spark plugs and connections. And that's basically it. So without further ado, let's get into it. And before I forget, I will have links in the description of all of these kits for you guys. So if you have a Mercury Pro XS that you are doing a service on, you will be able to purchase all this and do it at home, not have to take it to a shop and spend twice the amount. And by using these links and purchasing in my description, they're affiliate links. It goes directly into supporting the channel, and I would greatly appreciate that. Now, first things first, when you open up your package that comes with all of your items for the 100-hour service, it's always good to compare the invoice with what you actually get. And I know you guys will notice right here that this gear lube is not genuine Mercury, it's the aftermarket Quicksilver brand. And that's because if we take a look at this invoice here, you will see that they were supposed to ship us 2 quarts of the 1040 and then a gallon. And then right here on the bottom was the additional quart for the gear lube. And for whoever pulled the parts, they pulled 3 oil quarts and they did not put the gear lube in there. So I had to go and get this aftermarket. And that's why it's always good to review your invoice and match it to the parts, because they put the check marks on there, but they clearly did not take a look at what they were putting in the box. So that's your first tip of the day. Now let's go ahead and start draining the oil.
All right, let's get into this 100-hour service. Now, I'm going to be doing a voiceover for the remainder of this video, just a little FYI. So obviously the first thing we want to do is drain both the engine oil as well as the gear case oil. The engine oil drain plug is located on the starboard side of the engine. It's this little piece right here. It looks like a quick connect fitting, but actually what you can do is install a hose on the end of this, just a standard piece of rubber hose, and drain that into your oil pan. It actually helps a lot in not spilling anything. It doesn't drip down the side of your engine, especially if you're doing this service while your boat is on a boat lift. This helps tremendously. I'm just going to drain it directly into my oil pan, and it should be just fine for my case. To loosen the drain plug, you will need a 5/8 inch socket. Now, it's very important not to completely remove this drain plug. You only have to loosen it, and the oil will begin to drain through the inside of that metal tube that's coming out. And you can see I've trimmed the motor up just a little bit to keep the oil from dripping down the side of the engine. Now that we're done draining the engine oil, we're going to tighten the plug back up and move on to draining the gear case oil. Now, in order to do that, we're actually going to have to remove the prop, and the drain plug is actually located just underneath the prop shaft. To remove the prop, you're going to need a 1 1/8 inch socket, and I highly recommend getting one of these prop tools by TH Marine. It's just going to save your hands and help avoid you from getting injured and slicing your hand on the prop. I will have a link in the description so you guys can purchase that. It just makes the whole process super easy. It jams the prop into place. It doesn't scratch the motor. It doesn't scratch the prop. It's such a great tool to have. You can use some very heavy-duty gloves and hold the prop. I do not recommend putting the engine in gear. The compression alone will not be strong enough to keep the prop in place so you can loosen this nut. If you happen to have an electric impact, that will certainly work, but do not reinstall this nut with the impact. You always want to do this by hand. So with the nut removed, you can see there's a little retaining key in here. You want to make sure you do not lose that and put that in a safe spot. and then you can go ahead and pull the prop off, which will reveal the brass bushing that's behind that. And then you can see here just below the prop shaft, this little 10mm nut, this is the drain for your gear case oil. So we're going to remove the gear case plug with the 10mm and then come up to the starboard side of the engine. We're going to remove this vent screw with a large flathead, and this is going to allow the oil to drain a lot quicker. As the gear lube's draining, I always like to stick my finger in there and kind of feel it to make sure it doesn't have any metal fragments, it doesn't feel too chalky or anything like that. Once all that lube has been drained out of the lower unit, it's time to go ahead and put in the new lube. Now, they do sell these kits in your local marine stores. Basically what it is a pump that you can screw directly into your gear lube bottle, and the other end of it has this yellow piece that will screw directly into the lower unit, which is super helpful. All you do is thread this into the drain hole and it will be a perfect fit. Install the hose onto the end of it and then begin pumping that fluid directly in. Now, the service specifications say that it takes 0.9 quarts of gear lube, and it's really almost impossible to measure this. So what I like to do is pump the fluid in until I see it just begin to drain out of that vent hole up top, and that's how you know it's going to be filled. Now, I bet you're wondering what happens when I remove the yellow piece that I plugged into the bottom. Isn't the fluid all just going to pour out? Well, the answer is yes. However, what's going to help prevent that is by reinstalling the screw or the plug back into that vent hole. So we're going to tighten that down. You don't want to over tighten this thing whatsoever. It has this little yellow seal on it. As long as that yellow seal is good, you are going to be good to go. So we're just going to hand tighten that down, and then you can go ahead and unscrew the yellow piece from the pump and just have that little 10mm bolt ready to go, and barely any fluid will escape, and you will have a perfectly filled lower unit. From there, what I like to do is take some brake parts cleaner and clean out that area and clean the prop shaft of any stray residue, oils, and even some of that exhaust soot that comes out of there, just so when you go and put the boat back in the water, you're not leaking any oils or anything like that into the water. Now that we've installed the new gear lube, it's time to go ahead and remove the lower unit so we can go ahead and replace the water pump impeller. On the underside of the unit, there are 3 nuts with washers. They're 3/4 inch in size. And what I like to do is remove 3 out of the 4 nuts and washers and leave the last one partially threaded in, just in case if the lower unit decides to break free from that drive shaft housing, it doesn't come crashing down onto the floor. There is a hidden bolt underneath the trim tab that sits just above the propeller, so what you're going to want to do is go to the top of that lower unit. There's a little rubber plug that you'll need to remove, and in order to drop that trim tab, you'll need a 1/2 inch socket with an extension to remove that. Once that's removed from underneath, you'll need a 9/16 socket to come up from underneath to remove that small bolt. So with the bolt removed and 5 of the nuts and washers removed, you can see that my lower unit is stuck in there pretty good. So I'm just taking a rubber mallet and I'm going to slowly persuade this lower unit to come off. This lower unit on this particular engine has never been removed, and it's been used in the salt water quite extensively, so there's a lot of corrosion that has built up around the dowels that clock the lower unit into position on that drive shaft housing. Depending on your situation, it may take more or less persuasion, but as you can see, I eventually got it unstuck. And now with supporting the lower unit with my legs, I'm going to go ahead and remove that final nut and washer and then guide the lower unit out of the motor with my hands. Now that the lower unit's removed, I want you guys to take note of the small little shaft that's just in front of your drive shaft. This is the shifter lever. You do not want to touch this. Do not rotate it left or right. Keep it exactly where it's at. Same thing with the throttle controls on your helm. Do not put that into gear, forward or reverse. Leave it alone. This way, everything's going to stay clocked in its original position, so when you go to reinstall the lower unit, everything's right where it should be and you should not have any issues. Now that we're looking at the water pump portion of this lower unit, you can see that little black plastic tube that I've removed. You are not going to want to lose that. It has 2 orange O-rings in it that will need to be replaced. This bridges the gap from that impeller housing to the water inlet tube that sucks the water up through the rest of the motor. Now looking at the impeller housing, it's held in place with 4 10mm bolts. We're going to go ahead and remove those. On that drive shaft, there's also a little black rubber seal. We're going to slide that out. With the impeller removed from the housing, you can see that the fins are stuck in a certain position. This is what's called set, and this is why you replace the impeller in such short intervals. What can happen is if you put the motor in reverse, the fins might not clock in the opposite direction when the shaft is spinning backwards, and this could lead to no water flow whatsoever, which I'm sure you know is a very bad thing. What I like to do is take the impeller and start twisting it in a counterclockwise rotation. This is going to set those blades in the right position, and you just slowly spin it into place as you see here. You can see underneath the impeller housing is a block-off plate with gaskets on either side. Make sure you note the orientation that these are installed in, because you have to put the new ones in the exact same orientation. It can be tricky lining up this block-off plate with the impeller housing itself, so what I like to do is actually take 2 bolts, put that in the impeller housing, and then push up the first gasket, then the block-off plate, and then the lower gasket, using those bolts to align everything, and then carefully lower everything down and start to hand thread those bolts back into the lower unit. And this way I'll be able to install the other 2 bolts with some relative ease. It's also important to take note of the keyway. Now your water pump impeller kit should come with a new keyway. These don't get damaged very often, but they do give you a new one, so you might as well use it. As you're lowering the impeller housing, it's kind of tricky to get everything clocked, so you have to use your fingers, but there is a small little spot you can note on your water pump impeller where it lines up with the keyway. And if it's just slightly out of line, you can go ahead and take your drive shaft and rotate it so it lines up in the correct orientation with the impeller. And it doesn't take much. Once it's lined up, everything will just slide down perfectly. The only problem is it being a little tricky to keep that keyway into place and not fall out as you're getting everything lined up. As you're tightening back down the 10mm bolts, just make sure you go hand tight. You don't have to wrench these down super hard at all. Before we reinstall the lower unit, we have to go ahead and replace the O-rings inside that water tube that I showed you earlier. It is very helpful if you have a small pick to remove those old O-rings. It just makes it so much easier. And then when you're reinstalling the new O-rings, you do not have to use any tool whatsoever. Just use your fingers. Once you get the edge of the O-ring seated into place, you'll be able to press the rest of it in with your fingers, and it should all fall into place. So with all the impeller components replaced, before we go and reinstall the lower unit, I'm going to go ahead and clean off all of this corrosion that I see around the studs. And what I'm using to clean off this corrosion is a brass wire brush. Now that the corrosion's cleaned off, what I'm going to do is take an extra step and put some anti-seize on here. It's going to help prevent that corrosion from building up into place. and also keep those nuts from getting stuck on the studs if any corrosion does build up. So provided we did not move the shifter linkage in the lower unit as well as the shifter on the helm, everything should go back together with relative ease. So it's important to just take your time, slowly rise it back into place and line up the dowels, and a couple wiggles and shakes back and forth, it'll pop back up into place. Once you feel that lower unit to start to seat into place, you can take one of the nuts and washers and just slowly start that with a few threads. That'll keep everything in place so you can put all the remaining nuts and washers in, as well as that bolt that goes up from the underside as well. I typically like to save that bolt for last. Depending on the condition of your anodes, it's not necessary to replace them every 100 hours. Usually it's about the 300-hour mark you're going to replace the sacrificial anodes. In this case, these are getting pretty chewed up, so I'm going to go ahead and replace them on this engine. The anodes on the lower unit of these Pro XSs, you'll need two 10mm sockets to remove them. They're very straightforward. And then from there, we can reinstall that trim tab. On some motors, it's going to be a zinc anode. On others, like this one, it's made out of magnesium. Make sure it's clocked back into the proper position. Tighten everything back down. Don't forget to reinstall the rubber plug on top of the lower unit as well. And then you do have a long anode on the underside of the power trim of this motor. In my case, you could see that a bolt head broke off. And what I'm using here are some vice grips to grip onto that bolt, and I'm rocking it clockwise and counterclockwise to break up that corrosion that's built up on that bolt, which has caused the bolt head to break. The bolt was pretty seized up. I almost had to get some PB blaster out there, but luckily I was able to just rock it back and forth and extract that bolt by hand. The other one fortunately came out no problem. I've gone the extra mile and I've rubbed some of that marine grease on the underside of it, as well as put anti-seize on the bolts to help prevent any corrosion from building up for future services. When you're reinstalling this anode, you'll take note there is a ground strap on the port side. Just make sure you put that back in, and as you're tightening the bolt, make sure that ground strap doesn't rotate too far to where it breaks off. And then we can go move on to reinstalling the prop. And you can see my brass bushing here is filled with a ton of corrosion. It almost looks like rust. Before I put that back on, I'm going to take a wire wheel and clean it so it goes from looking like this to this. Nice and shiny and clean, and I'm actually going to take some marine grease and coat this with marine grease, which will help prevent any corrosion from building up on it in the future. It'll only last for so long though, so every time we put a new impeller shaft on, we're going to check this, clean it off, and reinstall new grease. And then from there, what I like to do is also put marine grease on the prop shaft itself. The idea behind this is to help corrosion from building up on that prop shaft, and it's also going to aid in removing the prop shaft, because as you saw earlier, I had to tap it with the mallet to get it off. So this is just going to make any future service that much easier. And then from there, that indexing washer, you want to make sure as you're putting that back on, there's tabs on opposing ends of it. Just make sure you line it up perfectly, and as you're putting the nut back down into place, it doesn't spin out of orientation. And then I mentioned it earlier, when you're tightening down the prop nut, again, just go hand tight. You don't want to over torque it with an electric impact or anything like that. Now we can move on to the top of the engine. I'm going to start with replacing the fuel filter. If you look down at the fuel filter, there's two quick connect fittings, and these are super easy to remove. You see that little red tab on there. All you have to do is press down on it, and those little quick connects will pull right off of either end of the filter. Taking a look at the new filter, it's important to note the orientation of the arrow, which indicates the direction of fuel flow. So you always want the arrow pointing into the engine. That means the fuel going from the tank is flowing into the engine. If you have this backwards, it actually acts as a check valve and your motor will not start. Reinstalling the hose ends, they just clip back on and you'll be good to go. You do not have to prime this filter or anything. The fuel pump in your engine will automatically prime it once you turn that key to the run position. Located on the starboard side of the engine is your oil filter. Now on these Pro XS's, these newer ones, they're going to have a little catch underneath the oil filter that will help catch any oil that happens to drip out. I still like to put some paper towels underneath just to make life a lot easier. Over time that catch will fill up with oil, so it's just going to help make future services that much easier by not leaving a mess. But typically not a lot of oil should come out of this little filter. Once the filter is removed, just take a quick peek and make sure the O-ring for the filter isn't stuck on the engine, and then you can go ahead and reinstall your new filter. I do recommend priming the filter, although you don't have to rub oil on that outside ring. It's going to have pre-lubrication on it already from the factory. It's a oil-based lubricant. So just prime the filter, give it a couple seconds for the filter to absorb that oil, and then quickly go ahead and install it. And you only want to install this hand tight. Do not use any type of oil filter wrench. That's absolutely not necessary. That O-ring is going to help make a positive seal and you'll be just fine. We're almost on the home stretch. We can go ahead and fill the engine up with oil. This particular 115 horsepower takes 7 quarts of oil. Filling up with oil is super straightforward. You have that yellow oil cap on the back. I always recommend using a funnel. Don't try and pour the oil directly from your containers into the engine without a funnel. You're just going to make a mess. On the port side of the engine is where our spark plugs are located, and they're very straightforward on these 4 cylinders to get to. You can see here I am using a tool to help get a better purchase on those spark plug boots. For whatever reason, these were super difficult to get off by hand, so I just used that tool to pull them off, but try and do it by hand if you can. And then from there I'm just using a spark plug socket to take the spark plugs out. The very bottom spark plug can be a little bit difficult to get into, so just find whichever way works for you by using your socket and extension, and you can just take that out. The new spark plugs do come pre-gapped from the factory. However, you always want to double check that gap and make sure that it has not been closed by someone dropping the spark plugs during transit, or they get bumped around or anything like that. Once you verify the spark plug gap is correct, just go ahead and reinstall the spark plugs hand tight. There's a crush washer on each spark plug, so you want to make sure it's crushed properly, but you don't have to over torque these things. You'll feel each spark plug clip into place. If you don't feel or hear that audible click, take a few extra seconds to make sure it's fully seated into place before moving on. The final component that needs to be replaced is the thermostat housing directly on the top of the engine. This is actually retained by 2 8mm nuts, so we're going to go ahead and break those loose and take them out of there. You might want to have a magnet on hand just in case any of these bolts get knocked out of the way. Now the hose that connects to the thermostat housing, your motor might be different than this one, but this actually has a band clamp on it that's crimped into place Unfortunately, I'm gonna have to break that clamp and remove it. And then what I have is just a basic worm style hose clamp that I'm gonna reinstall in place. It'll make future services easier, but you do not want to leave that hose without a clamp. If you do have the band clamp, make sure you go to a parts store and get a hose clamp to put in its place. Now, judging by all the corrosion that I saw on the lower unit as well as the anodes, I have a sneaking suspicion this is not going to be easy to remove, and I was right. And I did have to pry this off. And looking at the underside, you could just see this thing was frozen into place with all that corrosion. What I'm going to do is clean off that thermostat area as best I can. I'll install a little bit of marine grease around there to help prevent that. When you're reinstalling those 8mm nuts, you want to make sure that the new thermostat housing is seated down as far as possible before you go ahead and tighten the bolts down. There may be a little bit of a gap, which is okay, but you don't want the gap to be too big, because as you tighten one side, you could potentially break off one of the ears that the bolt holes go through. So just keep that in mind. Just push it down as best you can by hand and then go the rest of the way with the bolts. So we've replaced all the fluids, we've replaced all of the components for this service. We're going to go ahead and start the motor. I like to turn the key on and off a few times just to make sure the fuel filter gets properly primed, and then we'll go ahead and start that engine for just 5 or 10 seconds. And then what we do is we shut it off, go ahead and check our oil level. As you can see here, that oil level is directly right smack in the middle of the indicator, which is perfect. So I'll go ahead, put the dipstick back in, and we're going to run this motor for about 10 minutes. What I want to do is have the engine fully warm up, have the thermostat open up to make sure I know it's working properly, and we can verify there's no leaks and everything's working correctly. You'll see here I'm putting the motor in forward and reverse. I'm making sure that works properly, that we didn't knock anything out of place when we removed the lower unit. There's no grinding, there's no clunking. Everything sounds good to me. So that wraps up our 100-hour service video. I hope this video helped you guys out a lot. I appreciate you watching. And like I said, all of the parts and everything that I used is linked in the description. Those are affiliate links and they go directly into supporting the channel. And I greatly appreciate it if you make any purchases. With that said, thanks so much for watching. I'll see you in the next video.